Snow fell gently, blanketing the streets of Salem, Massachusetts, in a soft, white hush. Twinkling Christmas lights adorned the old colonial homes and shop windows, casting warm, colorful reflections across the icy sidewalks. Laughter and carols filled the air as families gathered around their fireplaces, sipping hot cocoa and sharing stories. But away from the warmth and joy, in a shadowed alley on the edge of town, a small, emaciated dog with matted brown and white fur shivered against the bitter chill of the night. His name was Max. He had once been a cherished companion, with eyes that sparkled with life and a wagging tail that never seemed to tire. Back then, he had belonged to Frank, an elderly man who loved to tell stories by the fire while Max curled up by his feet. But life had taken a cruel turn. Frank's passing left Max homeless, thrust out into a world that was unforgiving and cold. The little dog, who once knew nothing but love, had become just another stray, scouring the streets for scraps, his body shrinking with each day that food was scarce. Despite the hardships, Max had learned to navigate the town's maze of alleys and cobblestone lanes. He knew which restaurants tossed out leftovers, which park benches were safest to sleep under, and which street corners the kind-hearted would sometimes stop at, offering a small treat or a gentle pat. But winter had swept over Salem with a harshness that tested even the strongest of hearts. As the days grew colder and the nights longer, Max's reserves of strength dwindled. His once bright eyes now looked dull, and his paws were raw from trudging over ice. On the other side of town, a small, cozy house stood with a single window lit by the soft glow of an old lamp. It belonged to Edna, an 82-year-old woman whose silver hair framed a face marked by time but still beautiful with warmth. Edna was the kind of person who would smile at strangers and bake cookies for her neighbors. Yet, since the death of her husband, Harold, some years ago, a quiet sadness had taken root in her heart. Christmas, once a time of shared laughter and noisy gatherings, had become a reminder of the loneliness that now filled her days. Her children and grandchildren lived far away, and while they called to wish her a Merry Christmas, the hollow distance in their voices deepened her solitude. That Christmas Eve, Edna prepared herself a bowl of soup, her hands trembling slightly as she carried it to the small dining table. The old wooden house creaked with each gust of wind, and the only sound breaking the silence was the rhythmic ticking of the clock on the wall. She glanced at the mantel where faded photographs stood in frames, their smiles frozen in time. One photo, in particular, caught her eye, a Christmas long past when Harold held her hand under the glow of twinkling lights. Outside, the wind howled as if the night itself felt the weight of the season's despair. Max stumbled through the snow, his thin legs sinking into drifts that reached up to his chest. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, small clouds puffing out into the frosty air. Hunger gnawed at his belly, and exhaustion made his head swim. But somewhere deep inside, a spark of hope still flickered, the tiny ember of survival that had kept him moving, even as his strength waned. Suddenly, a sound interrupted the quiet of the street, a faint cry, almost swallowed by the wind. Max's ears perked up, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He tilted his head, listening intently. It wasn't the noise of people laughing or the rustle of wrapping paper. It was something else, something urgent and filled with distress. Inside her small house, Edna stood from her chair, her eyes drifting to the window as she felt a strange chill run down her spine. It wasn't just the cold, it was an instinct, the same one that had woken her up in the middle of the night when her children were young and had nightmares. But now, as she peered out into the icy darkness, she saw nothing but the swirling snow and the faint, golden glow of her neighbor's Christmas lights. Yet outside, a moment was unfolding that would intertwine the lives of the elderly woman and the stray dog in a way neither could have anticipated. Max, compelled by that faint noise, pushed forward, each step slower than the last but driven by something stronger than the biting cold, the sense that somewhere, someone needed him. And despite the pain in his limbs and the bone-deep weariness that threatened to pull him down, Max moved on, determined to reach the source of the sound that pierced the stillness of Christmas Eve. The wind grew stronger, whipping through Salem's narrow streets with a sharp, unforgiving bite. Max, panting heavily, forced his tired legs to move through the deepening snow, each step a monumental effort. his vision blurred with exhaustion, but the sound he had heard moments before echoed in his mind, an urgent cry that sparked a glimmer of purpose in his weary heart. A few blocks away, Edna stood in her living room, staring out the frosted window. The clock struck 9, chiming through the silence of the house. She rubbed her hands together, the chill of the night seeping through the old wooden frames of her home. The feeling of unease she couldn't quite place had settled deep within her chest. The wind howled outside, rattling the shutters, and she took a shivering step back. "Harold," she whispered, looking at his old armchair, now empty, as if seeking some reassurance from the memory of his presence. But the house was silent, offering no comfort, only the ticking of the clock and the low moan of the wind. Outside, Max's paws found the worn path that led to Edna's neighborhood, a place he had passed by many times but never dared approach. The houses here were spaced out, each with a yard guarded by snow-draped hedges and trees whose branches reached out like skeletal fingers. His keen nose caught the faintest whiff of something warm, food perhaps, but also something more, something human and distressed. Edna felt a sudden sharp pain in her chest, a tightness that made her catch her breath. She clutched at her sweater, thinking it was just the cold or the remnants of the grief that often caught her off guard. But the pain grew stronger, spreading like fire across her chest and down her arm. Panic set in, and she stumbled backward, grasping at the side table for support, sending an old photo frame clattering to the ground. Max's ears pricked up as the sound of glass breaking reached him, sharp even against the roar of the wind. His muscles tensed, and despite the searing ache that screamed through his thin body, he pushed himself toward the source of the noise. The flicker of light from Edna's window called to him, a beacon in the night. Inside, Edna's vision blurred with tears as pain and fear coursed through her. She tried to call out, but her voice came out as a weak rasp. The room seemed to spin, the Christmas lights on the small tree in the corner blurring into a swirl of red, green, and gold. Her body, suddenly too heavy, crumpled to the floor. Outside, Max reached the edge of the yard. The smell of warmth and the faint scent of something familiar, perhaps kindness, perhaps safety, drew him forward. He limped through the snow, his paws raw and bleeding from cuts that had reopened. The wind threatened to knock him over, but he pressed on, driven by the desperate need to answer the silent call for help. The window was cracked open slightly, a gap just big enough for Max to nose through. The warmth of the house hit him like a wave, and he let out a small, broken whimper. The noise, soft as it was, reached Edna, lying on the floor, consciousness slipping away. She forced her eyes open, and through the haze, she saw the outline of a small, scruffy dog standing in the dim glow from the Christmas lights. "Help," she managed, her voice barely a whisper. But Max understood. Something deep within him, a spark that had not died despite the hunger and the cold, ignited. With a low bark that belied his weakened state, he lunged at the door, pawing at it with all the strength he could muster. His nails scraped the wood, his body shuddered with effort, but the door did not budge. The sound of Max's barking, though weak, cut through the storm. A neighbor across the street, a middle-aged man named Tom, was taking out the trash when he heard the noise. He looked toward Edna's house, noticing the slight movement of the dog by the door. "That's odd," Tom muttered, adjusting the collar of his coat. He squinted, trying to make out what the dog was doing, but when Max let out another desperate bark, Tom's concern deepened. He tossed the trash bag aside and hurried across the street, his boots crunching through the snow. Max, sensing someone approaching, turned his head, eyes wide and pleading. Tom reached the porch just as he saw the little dog stagger and collapse from exhaustion. But in that moment, Tom's attention shifted. Through the window, he could see Edna's form sprawled on the floor, motionless. "Edna!" he shouted, banging on the door. When there was no response, he didn't hesitate. He forced the door open and rushed inside, feeling the frigid air swirl around him. Kneeling by Edna's side, he felt for a pulse, relief washing over him as he found one, though faint. "I'm here, Hold on," he said, grabbing the phone from the table and dialing 911. Outside, Max lay in the snow, his eyes fluttering as exhaustion threatened to claim him. But the last thing he heard before his eyes closed was Tom's voice shouting, "Help is on the way, and the sound of sirens wailing in the distance. Despite the pain and the cold that wrapped around him like a shroud, a warmth spread through Max's chest. He had done it. He had found help. And as the snow continued to fall, covering him like a blanket, he felt, for the first time in a long while, a sense of peace. The night was pierced by the flashing red and white of the ambulance as it pulled up in front of Edna's house. The snow on the ground glistened under the rotating lights, casting a surreal glow across the neighborhood. Paramedics rushed out, their boots crunching in the snow as they approached the house where Tom stood waving frantically, the worry etched into his face. "She's inside. On the floor," Tom shouted, stepping back to make room for them. The paramedics swept into the house, their movements precise and practiced. They checked Edna's vitals, exchanged quick glances, and immediately began administering oxygen and preparing her for transport. Tom stood to the side, his hands trembling as adrenaline coursed through him, eyes darting to Edna's fragile frame and the flashing machines the paramedics wielded. But outside, in the cold embrace of the snow, lay the small body of Max. He hadn't moved since he collapsed, his thin fur barely protecting him from the sharp claws of winter that sank into his tiny, exhausted frame. The sound of voices and sirens buzzed around him, muffled and distant, as if he were underwater. The effort to save Edna had left him spent, and the brief peace he had felt was slipping away into a dark void of silence and cold. As the paramedics secured Edna onto the stretcher and carried her out, one of them, a woman named Karen, glanced down and saw the small form of the dog lying motionless in the snow. Her brow furrowed and she paused. "Wait a second," she muttered to her colleague. Kneeling down, she reached out and touched Max's side. He was cold, too cold, and the slight rise and fall of his chest was barely perceptible. "Is he?" Tom asked, stepping closer, his breath visible in the frigid air. "He's alive, but just barely," Karen said, looking up at Tom. There was no time to waste. With a swift movement, she scooped Max up, cradling him to her chest. "I'm taking him with us." Tom watched, eyes wide with surprise and an unexpected swell of emotion. Max's small, frail body looked even more vulnerable in Karen's arms, and something stirred in Tom's chest, admiration, gratitude, perhaps even hope. The little dog, despite his state, had somehow managed to alert him to Edna's peril. He wasn't just another stray, he was a hero. The ambulance sped off, its siren wailing as it disappeared down the snow-covered street. Tom stood for a moment in the cold, watching the lights fade and feeling a peculiar hollowness settle in the pit of his stomach. He looked down at the tracks in the snow, the tiny paw prints leading to Edna's front door, now almost covered by fresh snowflakes. The dog had saved her, against all odds. At the hospital, the emergency room was a flurry of activity. Edna was whisked away to the cardiac unit while Karen gently placed Max on a heated blanket in a corner of the staff room. A young vet tech named Mia, who volunteered at the animal shelter and happened to be visiting a friend at the hospital, noticed the little dog and hurried over. "Oh, poor thing," she whispered, kneeling beside Max and running her fingers lightly over his thin, shivering body. She checked for any tags or identification, but there was none. His coat was tangled, and his paws were cracked and bleeding from the cold. "Come on, buddy, don't give up on us," Mia said, her voice soft but urgent. She grabbed a towel and gently rubbed his fur to help him warm up, while a nurse brought a small dish of water and a syringe to hydrate him. Max's eyes fluttered, a weak whine escaping his throat as he struggled to open them. The warmth began to seep into his body, bringing with it a dull ache that pulsed with each heartbeat. Edna, meanwhile, lay in her hospital bed, her face pale but serene. The beeping of the monitors was steady now, the crisis having passed. As she slowly woke from the fog of sedation, the first thing she noticed was the sterile smell of the hospital and the soft hum of medical equipment. A nurse leaned over her, smiling. "You're a lucky woman, Mrs. Harris. Your neighbor found you just in time," the nurse said, adjusting the foreline. Edna's brow furrowed as fragments of the night came rushing back. The sudden pain, the floor coming up to meet her, and then a noise. A bark. Her eyes widened, and she reached out weakly, clutching at the nurse's arm. "The dog, where is he?" "The little dog," she whispered, her voice cracking with urgency. The nurse exchanged a glance with the doctor at the foot of the bed, a look of mild surprise crossing her face. "You mean the stray? He's here in the hospital. He was in rough shape, but he's being taken care of." Tears welled up in Edna's eyes, and she nodded, relief mingling with a profound sense of gratitude. The image of the small dog at her door, the silent plea in his eyes, was vivid in her mind. She hadn't been alone, after all. A kind soul had been watching over her. In the staff room, Max lay on the blanket, his breathing steadier now, though still shallow. Mia stroked his fur gently, murmuring words of encouragement. "You're a little hero, you know that?" she said, smiling as she noticed a slight twitch of his ear. Max stirred, his body shuddering as warmth seeped back into his limbs. His eyes opened a crack, and the brightness of the hospital lights made him squint. The soft touch of Mia's hand and the soothing tone of her voice cut through the fog of exhaustion that clouded his mind. He blinked, his vision sharpening just enough to see the gentle face leaning over him, eyes filled with concern and kindness. "You're okay, little one. You're safe now," Mia said, her voice a balm to Max's frayed nerves. He felt the weight of a warm blanket pressing down on him and the sharp sting of the cuts on his paws as they began to heal under the care of antiseptic ointment. A sigh, soft and shaky, escaped his chest. For the first time in what felt like forever, Max wasn't fighting to stay alive. He was being cared for. In the days that followed, Max's story began to spread among the hospital staff and patients. They spoke of the scruffy little dog who had braved the bitter cold to save an elderly woman on Christmas Eve, a tale that warmed hearts and brought smiles to faces even as snow continued to fall outside. People who worked long, tiring shifts would peek into the staff room just to see the small hero lying on his blanket, his eyes slowly regaining their brightness. Edna's recovery was slow but steady. Each day she regained a little more strength, and each day she asked about Max. She learned from Tom's visit about how he had discovered her thanks to the little dog's persistent barking and the miraculous timing of the paramedics. The knowledge filled her with a sense of wonder. "Tom, he saved me," Edna whispered one afternoon when Tom visited her. He nodded, a smile breaking the somber lines of his face. "Yes, Edna. That little dog is a hero if I ever saw one." Edna's eyes misted over as she looked out the window at the gray sky beyond, the snowflakes fluttering down like whispers from the heavens. She made a decision then, one that filled her heart with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. "When I'm better, I want to see him," she said softly, determination lacing her words. A week later, with her health stabilized and her spirit stronger, Edna was given the go-ahead to leave the hospital. But before she returned to the quiet solitude of her small house, she had one request. The nurse wheeled her to the room where Max was resting, now alert and sitting up with a wagging tail that thumped weakly against the floor as he recognized her scent before he even saw her. Mia, who had been caring for Max diligently, stepped aside with a broad smile as Edna was wheeled into the room. The moment Max's eyes met Edna's, something unspoken passed between them. His ears perked up, and he let out a small bark, his tail wagging faster despite the ache in his limbs. "Oh, you sweet, brave boy," Edna said, her voice breaking with emotion. She reached out, her thin fingers trembling as they brushed against his fur. Max leaned into her touch, a soft whine escaping him as if to say, "I found you, I did it." Tears welled up in Edna's eyes as she looked at Mia, who nodded as if she had been expecting this. "He's yours if you want him, Mrs. Harris. He has no home, no one to claim him," Mia said. "But I think he's already chosen you." Edna let out a small, choked laugh, the sound fragile but filled with joy. She cupped Max's face with her hands, feeling the warmth of his fur against her palms. "Yes, my little hero. Welcome home," she whispered. The day Edna took Max home was a day unlike any other. The sky had cleared and a soft winter sun shone down, making the snow sparkle like a blanket of diamonds. Edna's neighbors, who had heard the story, waved and called out greetings as she made her way up the front steps of her house, Max trotting beside her on a leash that seemed more symbolic than necessary, as if he would ever stray from her side. Inside, the warmth of the small house enveloped them. The Christmas decorations were still up, and though the holiday had passed, Edna decided to leave them for a while longer. This was, after all, their Christmas miracle, late but no less beautiful. Max sniffed around the living room, his tail wagging as he found the spot where Edna had fallen, now just a memory of a moment that could have ended so differently. Life settled into a new rhythm. Edna found her days filled with the quiet joy of caring for Max. She watched as he regained his strength, his coat growing shinier, his eyes brighter. They went for walks in the crisp winter air, and on days when the sun melted the snow just enough, they sat on the porch together, Edna with her knitting and Max curled up at her feet. Tom visited often, bringing treats for Max and sharing stories over cups of tea. The once empty house was now filled with the soft sounds of life. The click of Max's paws on the wooden floor, the rustle of Edna's knitting needles, the occasional bark of greeting when neighbors stopped by to say hello. Max, for his part, flourished under Edna's care. The love and warmth she offered healed more than just his physical wounds. It mended the invisible scars left by his time on the streets. He no longer shivered with cold or cowered at the sound of sudden noises. Instead, he met the world with a quiet confidence, eyes ever watchful over Edna, his savior as much as he had been hers. One afternoon, as Edna sat with Max nestled beside her, she looked down at the little dog who had become her constant companion. "You know, Harold would have loved you," she said softly, a smile curving her lips. Max looked up at her with those deep, soulful eyes, as if he understood every word. And so, in the heart of Salem, amid the old houses and cobblestone streets, a story of resilience and kindness spread. It was whispered over fences, told in the aisles of the local grocery store, and recounted at the diner where Tom sometimes shared it with strangers over coffee. People would nod, smiles touching their faces as they pictured the tiny dog who defied the cold to save a lonely woman's life. It became a story not just of a miraculous Christmas night, but of second chances, of finding hope in the unlikeliest of places, and of how the smallest acts of courage can bring the greatest changes. And each time Edna's house glowed with the light of her lamp in the evening, casting a warm circle out into the snow-covered yard, there was Max, watching by her side, their bond unbreakable. Winter turned to spring in Salem, bringing with it fresh breezes and the soft scent of budding flowers. The snow melted, revealing green lawns and gardens that once lay dormant under the weight of the season. Edna's house, with its cheerful yellow paint and white trim, seemed brighter than ever as sunlight poured in through the windows. And within its walls, the laughter that had been absent for so long now rang out regularly. Max had become a fixture in the neighborhood, a small hero with a heart as big as the town itself. Children would come to visit, their fingers brushing through his fur as Edna watched from her rocking chair, a smile playing on her lips. Sometimes, Tom would sit beside her, a book in his hand, sharing stories of their younger days or simply enjoying the shared peace. Edna often reflected on that Christmas Eve, the night that changed everything. The loneliness that had gripped her heart for years had been pushed aside by the warmth of a newfound purpose and companionship. It wasn't just Max who had been given a second chance, it was her too. The days no longer felt long and empty. Instead, they were filled with small moments of joy that made life rich and full. For Max, the change was just as profound. The once starved, shivering dog now trotted proudly through the neighborhood on their walks, a bandana around his neck that Edna had sewn herself. He became known not just as the dog who saved Edna, but as a symbol of hope, resilience, and the powerful impact of unconditional love. When the sun set each day and they returned to their warm, light-filled home, Max would curl up at Edna's feet, eyes closing in contentment as she hummed an old tune. Their story became a reminder to everyone in Salem. No act of kindness, no matter how small, is ever wasted. Sometimes, salvation comes in the most unexpected forms. A stray dog with a fierce spirit, a neighbor willing to listen to a bark in the night, or an old woman who chooses to open her heart again. In the quiet moments, as Edna stroked Max's fur and felt the steady thump of his tail, she whispered a simple truth: "You saved me as much as I saved you." And so, on warm spring evenings, the glow from Edna's window continued to cast light into the darkening streets, a beacon of the bond that had turned a lonely Christmas Eve into the beginning of a beautiful, shared journey.